Everybody has made a video about Resident Evil 4. And why shouldn't they? It's a seminal game that deserves talking about. Even if you don't like it, it's fairly undeniable that the game was hugely important for the time, influential not just on the survival horror genre, but on action-adventure games in general. Resident Evil 4 is the reason we have Dead Space and Devil May Cry. It influenced the development of Gears of War, The Last of Us, and even genre-defining, mostly masterpiece BioShock. Its over-the-shoulder camera, which was brand new for the series, wasn't entirely new when Resi 4 adopted it. The original Splinter Cell used an over-the-shoulder camera when shooting, but it was the game that popularised the viewpoint as a viable way to play an entire game, and it would go on to feature in an increasingly huge number of releases. This is nothing new to anyone who has even passing knowledge of Resi 4, but it's always worth mentioning because it's quite possibly the most interesting part of the game's legacy. Picking it up today, you could be forgiven for thinking there's nothing much special about it. And you'd be right. These days, there isn't. But back in 2005, Resident Evil 4 was absolutely a game changer in the best possible way, and also in other ways. This is one of the few games from my teenage years that I was able to play at launch. I saved up a bunch of pocket money to be able to order it and politely reassured my parents that it was totally fine for a young teenager to play an 18-rated game. To be fair, my parents were never overly fussed about that sort of thing, for which I am definitely grateful. But regardless, I had a little old second-hand GameCube that has since died, which makes me very sad, and I was so very excited about this release. I read all of the pre-release interviews, the hands-on impressions, back when the Nintendo official magazine still existed. I chatted to my friend about it, my extremely Christian friend, who definitely probably used my house as an excuse to play the games he wasn't allowed to play at home. I'd played the Resi 1 remake by then, as well as 0 and the GameCube releases of 2 and 3, so I was already in love with the franchise and excited to see the new direction it was taking. The game really was a big deal, it can't be overstated enough. Resi 4 is the first game I remember seeing adverts for on television. After 9 PM granted, which is known as post-watershed in broadcasting. After 9 PM is, or at least used to be, the cut-off time for anything that was, family-unfriendly, I guess. And it was one of the only games I'd ever played where the cutscene graphics looked just as good as the gameplay, the others being Resident Evil 1 and 0. I didn't have many games growing up. Still, personal ramblings aside, the background to the game is pretty important for the coming video. Everybody talks about the best aspects of Resident Evil 4 all the time, and of course they would because it is a great game. Until very recently I would have had it on my own list of favourite games of all time, with the experience only being soured by the increase in quicktime events in video games, which weren't anywhere near as prevalent back in 2005 as they are now. But since everyone's already done that, I figured I'd take a slightly different swing at Resi 4. I love this game, don't get me wrong, despite the aforementioned QTEs, but it has to be said that very much like Dark Souls, Resi 4 was influential in both the best and worst possible ways. Hell, I'd say it's responsible for almost destroying its own franchise, by accident, granted, and I wouldn't be the first person to suggest that it's responsible for trending survival horror away from its roots and along a much worse path. Jim Sterling, still of Destructoid back in 2008, said this very thing, as did Matthew Pellet of Xbox World magazine, quoted as follows. If Leon's Spanish excursion wasn't enough to convince you of the series' jump from horror to action, then Resident Evil 5 will beat you senseless with ammo, and more ammo, until you grudgingly accept the truth. Any horror roots have long been severed. Now, I'm not going to argue that Resi 4 was bad actually, because that just isn't true. But if I want to even attempt to make a video that's different from the usual gushing, I'd like to do so by talking about the unexpected negative impact the game had on its own franchise and others, and on survival horror as a whole, but also how that negative impact slowly became a net positive again, particularly after a certain 2010 release. Prior to Resident Evil 4's release in January for North America and Japan, followed by PAL regions in March of 2005, the most recent entry in the series was Outbreak File 2, released in September 2004 in Japan, though it didn't reach Western shores until after the release of Resi 4. It received middling reviews between the 50 to 60% mark typically, and a third planned entry was cancelled due to the low sales, a shame given its predecessor's beloved status amongst the community. The most recent main entry, however, was Resi 0, released in 2002 exclusively for the GameCube, a status it would largely keep with the exception of the Wii re-release, until it was finally ported to 7th and 8th generation consoles in 2016. As it would turn out, Resi 0 was the last of the traditionally styled games, as Resident Evil 4 exploded onto the scene with its newfangled fancy camera, heavy action emphasis and slightly more linear, chapter-based progression. From the off, Capcom had always intended to have Resident Evil 4 rejuvenate the franchise in some capacity, although according to the book Itchy Tasty by Alex O'Neill, when Shinji Mikami claimed in 2000 that Resident Evil 4 would be a full model change, he wasn't entirely sure what he meant or what he truly intended for the game. As a result, Resi 4 would go through multiple iterations before finally settling on the vision that we know today. There were 3 alternatives to the final product, though one of them only ever reached the concept phase, whereas the Fog and Hookman versions had demos created. The Hookman video is easily the most recognisable, as it depicts a Resident Evil closer in design to prior games, with a dark and moody atmosphere and tight claustrophobic environments within a haunted building, though the over-the-shoulder view was utilised throughout this demo and would survive on to become the only camera style of the final product. Abandoning the staples of the genre was certainly a bold choice, but then the fears of the series becoming stale were hardly unfounded. Rare is it that series can survive without any kind of change, and Resi 4 was no different. I hesitate to say innovation, especially these days, but Resi 4 was absolutely innovative for the time. Game series tend to stagnate without a little flavour throughout their lifespan, whether it be small incremental changes or massive overhauls of the entire thing, breathing new life into a franchise that had otherwise basically been the same coat of paint for a decade or more. For some series, change rejuvenates, for others it can be ruinous. And though the immediate success of Resident Evil 4 proved that change was certainly needed, as it almost single-handedly obliterated the GameCube's reputation as a childish console, the ramifications of its achievements wouldn't truly be understood until its sequels were released. And that's not to say the game doesn't have its moments of horror. The Regenerators and Iron Maidens are horrifying enemies whose excellent sound design is enough to send a chill down your spine. Wandering through the dark village in the pouring rain, watching enemies violently mutate in front of you, fleeing or standing your ground when an invisible enemy begins to stalk you through the sewers. It has some fantastic moments that are nail-biting, but rather than serve the overall tone of the game, they sometimes come off as somewhat token reminders of the series' roots. Don't get me wrong, they're still great, but the game is overwhelmingly focused on its action, slowing down briefly to remind you that it still knows how to throw you off your game. Many of these aspects are standout moments. People aren't overly fond of the island, but they are very fond of the Regenerators. Some of Resi 4's best aspects are hidden in plain sight. As we've already long since established, Resi 4's commitment to the over-the-shoulder camera proved to be extremely popular, influencing action and horror games for years to follow. The decision was a sound one. Fixed angles wouldn't have suited the tone of the game and allowed for a much more focused view of the upcoming areas, the action, and the enemies. Precision combat was extremely important, and as the game veered towards focusing far more on survival through combat than puzzles, looping areas at oppressive angles, it makes sense to avoid the pitfalls of prior tropes. In addition to its updated camera, Resi 4 also features a fair few quicktime events or QTEs, often credited as being popularised by Shenmue back in '99 on the Dreamcast. Like its camera, Resi 4's use of QTEs to keep players engaged in the action, even during cutscenes, was certainly commendable for the time, but it was only the beginning of a long spiral into games using QTEs in place of their action rather than to complement it. The result is that, of all of the aspects of Resi 4, the QTEs are the one that feel the most outdated and tacked on, but it's important to recognise that this is a result of the overabundance of them in modern games, not due to any failings on Capcom's part back then.
The satisfying sound of one's impalement.
That being said, QTEs that result in death quickly become frustrating, as the player must restart an entire cutscene and listen to dialogue from the beginning, and nowhere is that more apparent, nor more infuriating than during the knife fight with Krauser, although at the very least it does have a checkpoint halfway through. I don't know if it's necessarily right to suggest that Resident Evil 4 paved the way for games that now largely use QTEs as the focal point of their action with otherwise limited interactivity, but its popularity indirectly influenced many things in the industry, so perhaps we should still mildly chastise it for allowing someone like David Cage to create his works of art. Fahrenheit, or Indigo Prophecy in the US, was the first Quantic Dream game released in September 2005 to pretty good reviews. But like many aspects of the industry, the continued release of games overwhelmingly driven by nothing but QTEs quickly became a point of contention. And it didn't help that Quantic Dream's writing was a little bit trite, to say the least. The trend of stale gameplay, particularly in reference to QTEs, really reared its head during the Telltale Games era. At the height of its popularity, Telltale were producing games for enormous franchises: The Walking Dead, Borderlands, Back to the Future, Game of Thrones. They excelled in episodic narratives that typically focused on difficult choices and the consequences, for the most part, but the longer they went on, stretching themselves impossibly thin across far too many projects, and failing to fix the faults of their increasingly dated engine, the more imminent their demise. It was to the surprise of pretty much nobody that Telltale closed down in 2018. People grew tired of the formula. I maintain that the first season of The Walking Dead was an excellent game, but there's no denying that clinging to the staples of their genre and stretching for multiple products at a time instead of focusing their efforts into one or two ultimately led to Telltale's downfall. So it's not hard to see why the choice to make so many massive changes to the Resident Evil formula was necessary. The ripple effect was immediate, and in the same year of its release, the sequel was announced. Resident Evil 5 would eventually be released in 2009, abandoning the limitations of Nintendo's hardware in favour of an Xbox 360 and PS3 release. And most definitely for the better, because even today, almost 14 years later, Resi 5 is a damn good looking game. Like its predecessor, 5's success was immediate, bolstered by the choice to release on multiple powerful platforms day one, during a time when gaming was absolutely hitting its stride. It would go on to outsell Resident Evil 4 by a decent margin, totaling approximately 12.6 million sales compared to 4's 11.2 million. Though numbers vary depending on the sources, with some stating 12.3 for 4 and 14.6 for 5. Either way, with the release of 5, the cracks were beginning to show. In his review of Resi 5, Brian Crescent said that the game dropped all pretense of being a survival horror title and unmasked itself as an action shooter title. And he's not wrong, but it's not necessarily the biggest fault most people have with 5. Its controls, limited inventory system, and decision to cling to older tropes of its series, such as the inability to shoot whilst moving, were frequently criticised, though overall it was still highly rated, with scores averaging around the mid-80s mark. Hell, I bought an Xbox 360 just for this game, and I had the game itself for about 2 months before I had enough money to actually buy the console. The day I was finally able to put the disc in the tray was a magical moment. Anyway, I'd say the biggest issue with Resident Evil 5 boils down to two things: the absolutely uncompromisingly poor partner AI and the game's overall tone. Sheva as a character is totally fine. She's witty but appropriately stern when needed, sensible and confident, and she is a much needed contrast to Chris's furrowed brow, broody, boulder-punching machismo. But when playing this game solo, Sheva's AI is abysmal. She will waste healing items and ammo, give you items that you don't need, like ammo for guns you're not even carrying, or ammo when you have infinite ammo turned on. She will get stuck on scenery, waste time running around in circles, and she will absolutely refuse to use any other guns in her inventory besides her pistol unless you forcibly take the pistol away from her. It is so very irritating playing this game with her AI at your side, and it's far more enjoyable to play with a friend as a result. There is one theory that I have about Sheva's staunch refusal to let go of the pistol. I strongly suspect that she was designed this way deliberately to prevent her from wasting ammo that the player can put to better use. You can give her all sorts of guns and ammo to go with them, but she will flat out not use them unless you remove the handgun from her inventory. She'll then instead default to whatever the weakest weapon in her inventory is and will continue to give ammo to the player instead. I honestly believe that she's designed this way so that the player can choose when and where the strongest guns and ammo are used, and in that regard it does make sense. Doesn't change the fact that it's a little annoying having her fire a pea shooter at Wesker, but, well, you know. Speaking of which, let's diverge briefly to discuss one of the more common complaints about Resident Evil 4 that I see these days, it being an escort quest. This is true, to be fair. There are chunks of Resi 4 that revolve around protecting Ashley, usually with her being stapled to your back and fist pumping every time you shoot someone off a cable car. But from time to time you must be quick on your trigger finger to keep enemies away from her while she stands on a platform and turns a crank excruciatingly slowly. If Ashley is grabbed and carried through a door, the game is over and you must start again from a save or checkpoint. This is typically a loading screen door or one that Leon can't physically reach, although this varies from level to level. Similarly, if Ashley is killed by either enemies directly or by your own friendly fire, pro tip, if an enemy has grabbed her, don't shoot them with a shotgun. The game is over. She has very little HP and can take very few hits, although this can be mitigated a little with the game's golden herbs. You can mix these with green or green and red herbs to make a healing potion, powder, dubious fluid that will slightly raise her HP. But you may want to focus on keeping Leon alive most of the time, as this is more frequently a problem than keeping her alive is. Still, whilst I agree that escort quests in general are not particularly great, this is another example of something that has grown far worse over time. In many escort quests these days, the escortees are borderline useless, die extremely easily, and cannot be commanded or controlled in any way to help prevent their inevitable demise. Whilst Ashley is infuriating at times, screaming and wailing like the young adult that she is, to be fair, you can at the very least order her to wait in place, letting you stick her further back in a room whilst you camp the door or the stairs, and she's generally fine unless you wander too far away, and the randomly spawning enemies grab her and drag her off. You can also stick her in an oversized bin in multiple areas, usually in the village, which renders her entirely invisible to the enemy and lets you deal with them until you can go back and collect her. Hell, if you try to leave the area, Leon will politely remind you through his inner monologue that he can't leave dear old Ashley behind, sadly. And most importantly, there is much more time spent without Ashley than there is with her. In fact, it becomes comical how much she is kidnapped or otherwise parted from Leon, to the point where the complaints about her nagging are almost entirely moot. Throughout the game, you are free from Ashley during the entirety of Chapter 1, all of 2-1 with the exception of a short walk and a ladder, the entire tower defense section in 2-2 where she hides in a cupboard, all of 3-2 and 3-3, almost the entirety of Chapter 4 with the exception of about half of 4-1, the entirety of 5-1 barring the end of chapter cutscene, all of 5-3, the majority of 5-4, and with the exception of the very beginning and the very end, all of Chapter 6, during which you're not required to protect her, you just need to not die on a jet ski. So if you are keeping count, you are escorting and protecting Ashley during 2-2, 2-3, 3-1, 4-1, 5-2, and a minuscule amount of 5-4. There are 19 chapters in the game, and you're required to protect her during 5 and a squidge chapters. And I'm discounting the 30 seconds of 5-4 because it is literally a single corridor with 3 enemies. That works out at about 26 and change % of the game, not accounting for the parts of the aforementioned chapters where you're separated, or otherwise not responsible for her safety. It's definitely a good thing that Sheva is a partner rather than an escort quest, but it doesn't change the fact that if she dies, it's game over, and given how infuriatingly dense her AI is and how you are with her for a whopping 100% of the game, she might as well be an unusually well-armed escortee. And this is unrelated to anything, but I need you to know that this happened while I was recording Resi 4 for this video. She called me a pervert because she ran over me while I was flat on my back on the floor. I love this game. The tone is another issue entirely. Where Resident Evil 4 was borderline self-aware with its parody of its own franchise, its classic one-liners, absurdly over-the-top bosses, and giant walking statues of small grey-haired 20-year-old children, Resi 5 was stone-cold, straight-faced, even as its protagonist beat the ever-loving bejesus out of a boulder during its final confrontation, in the middle of a volcano. In the middle of the ocean. Somewhere in Africa. It was uncharted levels of silly, but Chris's brooding melancholy throughout the entire thing, largely in part due to the definitely not at all unlikely death of Jill Valentine, was absurd when partnered against a man in a Matrix trenchcoat and shades catching rockets and dodging bullets. Where Resi 4 felt like it was laughing at itself, Resi 5 felt like it had forgotten what the joke was. It's a shame, because honestly, I really like Resi 5. The biggest reason for this is that I genuinely do love the Wesker and Jill boss fight during Act 5, in large part due to the fantastic music that plays during it, entitled Sad But True.
Remove that device on her chest. She might turn to normal.
All right. And that's what we're— Jill, what are you doing? Stop this! Jill, answer me! It's me, Chris! Don't you recognize me?
I would argue that despite its slightly daft premise, the showdown between Jill, Chris and Sheva is the only part of Resident Evil 5 where the tone is completely in tune with the character's actions. The music truly does encapsulate this, and whilst Resi 5's soundtrack in general is a blast, Sad But True is the absolute peak of its attempts to downplay its silliness in favour of real emotion. Chris's frantic shouts, Jill's increasingly desperate struggle, and the relatively close quarter combat all draws together in an extremely out-of-place fight for the franchise as a whole, but one done so damn well that I just don't care how weird it is. It does seem that in general the internet is fairly favourable towards Resi 5. Browsing Reddit and YouTube comments, the majority of people do have fond memories of it, and though I'd argue it's let down by the increasing reliance on QTEs and the U-turn from Resi 4's campy B-movie tone, as a package in and of itself, it is a fine game. The problem of its overwhelming abandonment of the series' core nature didn't begin with Resi 5, it began with the 4th game, although both games still retain semblances of their former selves. But whilst Resi 4 felt like a necessary evolution for the franchise, a way to stave off stagnation, Resi 5 felt like it took a few paces back, capturing the ridiculous nature of the franchise's lore and characters, but forgetting to laugh along with them. 5 built on the success of its predecessor, that's for sure, and I still love it for what it is, but it was the second stage evolution of a monstrosity that ultimately forced Capcom's hand with Resident Evil 7. Which is odd, to say the least, because Resident Evil 6 sold just as many copies as Resi 4. I've said this before, I think, but Resident Evil 6 is my least favourite of the entire franchise, outside of the cheap cash-in multiplayer games that Capcom insist on throwing out every few years. Even now, as I've reached the point of this script where I'm forced to talk about this game, I struggle to think of anything nice to say. Now, the game isn't overwhelmingly utter pants in a portaloo, it has its moments, sometimes, but there is nothing in this game that appeals to me personally. I've tried to play it many times. I bought it at launch, played through roughly 90 minutes of Leon's campaign and quickly gave up out of frustration and boredom. I tried to play again after a few patches and still hated it. I have beaten it in its entirety exactly once, and the only reason I managed to do so was because I forced my partner to buy it and suffer through it with me. Every time I've played it since, it has been either with my partner or for 5 minutes before remembering why I hate it. I'm belabouring this point because it's important for me to acknowledge that I find it hard to be objective about Resi 6 because of just how much I dislike it. I just want to make sure that's clear so it doesn't come across as me considering my opinion as the be-all and end-all, since it absolutely isn't at all. A lot of people like this game. Bringing myself to play this game solo just to get enough footage for this video though was painful. Even ignoring my own personal grievances with it, the game is so unbelievably bloated that it's ridiculous. There are 4 campaigns, each ranging from 8 to 10 hours long, give or take some change, with many of them crossing over into other campaigns at various points, which forces you to fight the same boss in the same arena but from a slightly different viewpoint, multiple times. The writing and tone is all over the place, from the relatively reasonable pacing of Leon's campaign to the absolute abomination of Chris's campaign, in which Chris's brooding becomes so broody he grows broody amnesia brain and spends half his time either shouting, punching things, or both. The number of times that you will waste all of your ammo on a boss only for it to get right back up again over and over is astounding. Simmons, in Leon's campaign, is the most egregious example of this, requiring you to fight and kill him on at least 4 different occasions throughout the entire campaign. Aside from this, there are many events that happen in this game purely and simply out of the stupidity of everyone involved, or only happen because nobody can have anything at all ever. Downtime is not allowed in Resident Evil 6. Took a bus to get out of the city? No, the bus must flip over and crash and explode and kill every single person inside except plot-armoured Leon and Helena, because the idiot who was driving it doesn't understand how brakes work. The number of times Chris just doesn't get hit by thousands of exploding needle bombs is staggering. Some of the attempts at emotion are quite entertaining, and the entire drama surrounding Ada and not Ada gets increasingly more convoluted and, to be honest, much creepier and much more absurd than the game itself even acknowledges, the further through it you go. It's certainly an extremely varied and creative game. There are moments of Jake's campaign that are genuinely quite interesting, and each campaign does feel distinct in its own right. But for me personally, this just was not what I wanted from Resident Evil. 5 might have been a little bit derivative of 4, but it was at least a tight, focused experience that mostly knew what it was trying to be. In all honesty, the biggest problem with Resident Evil 6 isn't its length, its bloat, or its commitment to utter absurdity whilst also mirroring the stone-faced serious tone of Resi 5, despite the frenetic situations it throws us into. It's that it completely and utterly demolished any last vestiges of survival horror that Resident Evil had left. The game was labelled as dramatic horror by Capcom, and there was no denying that beyond the token almost zombies of Leon's campaign, by and large considered the purest Resident Evil experience of the entire thing, there was next to nothing of what made Resident Evil interesting or unique left. The game looks great for the most part, it's well acted despite the wacky shenanigans, and it's certainly memorable, even if that isn't always for good reasons. In his 1up.com review, Jose Otero said, "While building on that game's masterful formula of stop and pop gunplay as a smart approach, RE6 serves as proof that too many compromises and too much empowerment can ultimately erode what makes Resident Evil, at its core, work." Updates to the controls and the addition of being able to move and shoot simultaneously were praised, but many other aspects were criticised. The size of the character on the screen, for example, the poor angle of the over-the-shoulder camera, the inventory system, the increased amount of QTEs, the repetition. Many of these are issues I personally have with the game, but whilst I'm honest about the fact that I hate it because I don't enjoy balls-to-the-wall action in what is supposed to be a horror game, I wouldn't argue that it's a terrible game in and of itself. And listen, a lot of people still like RE6. It is a fun game to blast through with a friend, mostly because the new movement abilities are just really funny, to be honest. Leaping joyfully about on train tracks will never not be entertaining. There are certainly some extremely angry and defensive rants in the comments of Jose's review, linked below if you're curious, and I want you to know that just because I hate the game, that doesn't mean you're required to like it any less. There are lots of games that people love that I dislike or thought were just okay, and that's cool. It'd be a pretty boring world if everyone liked the same thing, don't you think? But, in my opinion, this just was not the right game for Resident Evil as a franchise. It's the most divisive of the mainline Resi games, and it just isn't much fun to play through when you know you have to fight the same boss multiple times with different characters, just because they happen to have a crossover during a particular part of their campaign. There is a reason why Resident Evil 7 is what it is, and why it was so well received by fans and critics alike. 6 was unfortunately a product of its time, of Call of Duty dominance and cover-shooting action-adventure games. Big-budget horror was in a bit of a slump in the early 2010s, especially when Dead Space 3 wound up being the series' death knell and Silent Hill was killed off with very little fanfare for over a decade. So it's not surprising that Capcom went for accessibility and explosive action over slow, creeping dread. If I'm arguing that without Resi 4 being what it was we wouldn't have ended up with 6, then I have to also admit that if 6 wasn't as divisive as it was, 7 might have been something else entirely. Something far less interesting. Resident Evil 5 was the misstep, and 6 was the biggest culprit and the biggest victim. There's no denying that. But Resident Evil 4 was the first step along that path. And despite 6's relatively warm reception among critics, people often forget that 7 out of 10 is still a good score, and still a recommendation, despite the internet's rage when that number gets given out. And its financial success, Capcom made the sensible decision to go back to the drawing board again with 7. But that wouldn't be until January 2017, 3 years after the release and death of PT. Before that happened, in the background of the industry, one small Swedish company quietly toiled away on an alternative vision for horror gaming. Reading through the Wikipedia page for survival horror as a genre, there's an interesting note here that suggests that during the early 2000s, gaming trends began to drift closer to Western expectations, that players began to grow tired of cumbersome controls and limited inventories. There was certainly a trend for games informed by the survival horror genre of the 90s to focus a little more on the action side of things. 2005's Fear successfully combined fast-paced action with Japanese horror tropes of spooky little girls and psychological horror. 2008's Dead Space was a strong, creeping horror that also featured turret shooting sections. The Western Silent Hill games began to prefer active action over defensive acts, with one notable exception. And even later efforts, like The Evil Within, created by Shinji Mikami, still featured strong action set pieces alongside its horror elements. That's not to say that there weren't any games or franchises that stuck to their guns though. Fatal Frame, or Project Zero as it's known in Japan and Europe, continued to remain true to its roots throughout its run, all the way up until its most recent release, Maiden of Blackwater, a tragically Wii U exclusive game until it was finally ported in 2021. Forbidden Siren produced 3 games, one in 2004, one in 2006, and another that was a reimagining of the original game in 2008, all of which were focused on the horror over the action. 2008's Blood Curse was unfortunately a little forgotten in the shuffle, and the series has remained lost in the past since then. And though Silent Hill Homecoming was extremely action-heavy, feeling more like an attempt at a Hollywood movie than a video game, the series still largely stuck to its roots, with Homecoming being the biggest outlier amongst the remainder of the Western-developed games. But the industry as a whole saw Resident Evil 4's success and acclaim and ran with it, especially as the late 2000s began to drift into the nightmarish hellscape that allowed microtransactions to flourish. The industry became less about innovation, uniqueness and creativity, and almost entirely about maximising profits. Following Resi 4's success, horror as a genre, especially big-budget horror, moved away from slow-building tension and instead trended towards an oppressive atmosphere, primarily engaged with through guns, melee weapons and bombast. The natural evolution of the genre resulted in a combination of action horror games like those mentioned above, or recent games like the Callisto Protocol, and interactive horror, largely pioneered by Supermassive Games with their 2015 debut Until Dawn, combining the story and atmosphere of horror with the QTE-driven narratives of prior efforts crafted by Quantic Dream. But Resident Evil 4's success and the subsequent homogenization of action horror also inadvertently brought about a very different kind of game, a return to the roots of survival horror that, when it began, was small and unassuming, but by 2010 would suddenly, and very much deservedly, explode into the mainstream. Penumbra Overture was released on the 30th of March 2007, the first game developed by Frictional Studios and released just shy of 3 months after their official founding on the 1st of January 2007. It was followed by Black Plague and Requiem in 2008, completing the planned Penumbra trilogy. Taking cues from older survival horror games as well as elements from point-and-click adventure games, Penumbra as a series is overwhelmingly focused on creeping through dark, tight corridors, surrounded on all sides by horrific noises and avoiding the gnawing jaws of roaming monstrosities. Environmental interaction is unusually high for the genre, allowing you to drag crates, boxes, wooden beams, rocks, and much more to block doorways and prevent you from being chased, or to break things in search of items that can improve your survivability and solve puzzles, something that is often required. For the most part, you are alone in the facility that you find yourself in, although this does change quite dramatically in Black Plague. And the game is dark. Much like Silent Hill before it, the player is put in the boots of an average everyman whose combat skills are lackluster, and whose big brain is meant to be the way forward rather than burly forearms. There are some interesting insights into the mindset of reviewers going into this game, through GameSpot's comments noted as saying that fights are often so frenetic that it's almost impossible to control your movements, and that it would have been much more sensible for the camera to lock on and move with enemies. And I'd like to just point out that one of the first things the game tells you to do is hide, not fight. It's not subtle about this either. It's pretty blatant. I mean, look at it. With that being said, Black Plague would run with the criticisms of its predecessor's combat and end up focusing almost entirely on stealth, and this is the basis from which Frictional Games' future endeavours would build, because playing Black Plague is like playing a prototype for one of the most important games in modern horror. In August 2010, Frictional Games released its seminal classic, often touted as one of, if not the, greatest horror game of all time. I'm fairly sure I've said this before, but Amnesia: The Dark Descent is an absurdly important game, though perhaps not for the reasons that you might think. It was hugely influential in the Let's Play market, responsible for the explosion of numerous YouTubers who would go on to become huge in the gaming scene. The immediate aftermath of Amnesia's surprise success was a torrential downpour of similarly styled games that crept through the cracks of Steam Greenlight and Itch.io. And eventually, echoes of its success would leak into future releases that would go on to revitalise the genre in a similar way. Releases like 2014's PT, which itself resulted in an unfathomable number of clones that absolutely missed both the mark and the point. The story of Amnesia is a harrowing one, with the developers discussing its cycle as being plagued by financial problems and concerns over the sales in its initial week. However, 1 month later, Frictional was seeing increasing gains, and as word of mouth spread the game far and wide throughout the internet, the game would eventually sell just shy of 400,000 units, by the 1-year mark. A remarkable accomplishment for such a small team. Current sales estimates place it at around 1.4 million units, with multiple ports to modern consoles and a series of sequels released. Amnesia's dedication to its atmosphere, level design, and sparing use of haunting, visceral music, as well as its Lovecraftian themes and run-and-hide puzzle-based gameplay was widely lauded, and it is certainly a return to form for the survival horror genre. A strong modding community gathered around the game, and there are a huge number of fan-made stories that can be played within the game itself with the full support of the developers. There's even a total conversion mod for Amnesia based on Penumbra, called Necrolog, that is a fan-made sequel to the game's predecessor. For a long time after its release, it was not uncommon to see floods of indie horror games that featured Amnesia's gameplay mechanics, click-dragging doors, opening every cupboard in search of the one item that you need, crouching in corners and piling furniture against the doors to stop monsters. Like many games that tried to capitalise on a recent success, the issue was that they were openly aping the game without much effort, failing to understand why Amnesia worked as well as it did. And in the end, they oversaturated the market with insufferably samey releases. Many of them were covered by horror-based YouTubers itching to find the next best release, and whilst there was certainly a good number of similarly styled games put out there, Amnesia's success would pave the way for releases that built up on its core ethos whilst adopting their own unique aesthetic. Games like Outlast, Layers of Fear, and the much-beloved Alien Isolation. As a result of the rising interest in games where combat was largely eschewed in favour of atmosphere, a spiralling trend eventually evolved into the rise of walking simulators, many of which featured horror themes and existentialism themselves. What Remains of Edith Finch, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Strong story-driven games absent of typical gaming elements that focused on providing a tighter narrative experience than on guns blazing, nail-biting action. As the AAA industry blossomed with trials and tribulations around microtransactions, online passes, and pride and accomplishment, the indie scene focused on what was most important: compelling stories and rich atmosphere, though of course for every Amnesia: The Dark Descent there were 100 Steam greenlight failures. And then the exact same cycle happened when PT was released, and then again when PT was unceremoniously pulled from the PlayStation Store. There are an ungodly amount of low-budget indie horror games that think a looping corridor is scary in and of itself. It's not. The reason PT worked so well is because we knew it was building up to something more important and that this wasn't the final game, something the clones failed to do. It's taken a while to escape the PT cloning, but we've slowly evolved from opening all the cupboard doors to looping hallways to a fairly pleasant and mostly stable series of retro-styled horror games, both first and third person. The quiet but strong indie gaming scene, largely revolving around RPG Maker horror, persisted throughout the entirety of the genre's ups and downs, and nowadays we're seeing a resurgence in many of these unassuming little titles. Things like Omori, Ib, Yume Nikki, Off, Mad Father, Ao Oni, The Witch's House, Misao, Corpse Party, almost all of which have had updated versions released on Steam and on consoles. For a time there were a ton of these kind of games that were freeware, often having to be sourced from places like RPGmaker.net or ModDB. Shuld, Desert Nightmare, Paranoiac, Mermaid Swamp. Horror is a genre that ebbs and flows. It never really goes completely out of fashion. But like everything, the trends come and go, and these days the trends tend towards PS1 era graphics and often clunky controls. PC was a huge deal because at the time there was nothing else like it. It was clever, unique, and it brought the internet together in a flurry of experiments to plumb the depths of its secrets. And whilst it's very likely true that Capcom had already begun working on Resident Evil 7 as a first-person experience, long before PC was released, the game's appeal absolutely capitalised on Konami's carpet bombing of their beloved franchise. And then the Resident Evil 2 remake came out and everything changed again. About that legacy of Resident Evil 4. It's unreasonable to suggest that Resi 4 is entirely responsible for the gaming industry trending towards it, then away from it, and ultimately back towards it again, but it absolutely stands as a pivotal moment in gaming history. We might still have had Amnesia without Resi 4 being what it was, but there's no denying that what Amnesia is, and the games that spawned off the back of its success, was largely informed by the trend away from traditional horror that the AAA market embraced as a result of Resi 4's success. But unlike many developers around these days, Capcom do, at the very least, seem willing to acknowledge criticism and work to improve themselves and their products. They're not perfect by any means, Their determination to force a multiplayer Resident Evil game to work somehow, damn it all, is thoroughly adorable. When DMC was widely derided and an actual sequel was demanded, Capcom acquiesced and provided the outstanding Devil May Cry 5, a proper continuation of the franchise that made stunning use of their RE engine. When Resident Evil 6 sold well but upset many, Capcom hurried back to the drawing board and revitalised their franchise for a second time. Resident Evil 4, and the franchise as a whole, is a great example to look at if you want to learn how a company avoids stagnation. Nobody was asking Capcom to reinvent the wheel, but they did. Reboots are a complex discussion at the best of times, and there are a huge number of franchises that deserve to be brought back, but have instead been left to rot in the annals of history. There are an equally large number of franchises who have been rebooted and still been left to rot. Yes, I had my problems with the Resident Evil 3 remake, but damn it, at least Capcom tried. We'll be lucky if we ever see a real conclusion to Adam Jensen's story, or if that Perfect Dark reboot announced 2 or 3 or however many years ago it was ever sees the light of day. The new Colossus left on an open-ended note that strongly suggested a third entry for Mr. BJ, but that was almost 6 years ago at this point, and like Tomb Raider 2013, that was also the second time that the parent franchise had been rebooted. Alone in the Dark, the grandfather of survival horror, had been left to decay in a basement before it was suddenly revitalised with a reboot slated for sometime this year. Many, many franchises have died whilst Resident Evil persists, evolving as often as the monsters it created. And no matter what you think of it, we absolutely have Resident Evil 4 to thank for that. A bold move or a rash decision, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that even if only in some very small way, thanks to a detachable right hand and the satisfying sound of one's impalement, I get to gush about some really, truly outstanding horror experiences. With the advent of the Resi 4, Dead Space and Silent Hill 2 remakes, this might well change again, but for now, this is what we have to live with. Did I ramble a bit? I think I rambled a bit. Thanks for watching. If you like what I do and want to see more, maybe hang around a bit longer. I might finally get around to talking about that one game that I keep banging on about. You know the one.